Imagine a courtroom packed with smug middle-aged suburbanites, all eagerly clutching their HOA rulebooks like they're sacred texts handed down from Mount Olympus. Now picture Lucas Dawson, a lanky teenager with a pair of crutches, striding into this den of self-righteousness like he's walking the runway at New York Fashion Week. The naysayers whisper, the HOA lawyer smirks, and Lucas? He's got a secret weapon that none of them see coming. Lucas Dawson wasn't your average teenager. Sure, he had the usual quirks, an obsession with chess and an inexplicable love for vintage law books, but he also had something most people didn't, a knack for turning adversity into ammunition. Born with a physical disability that required him to use crutches, Lucas had spent his life navigating both literal and metaphorical obstacles. And if there was one thing he'd learned, it was this: people underestimate you when you don't fit their cookie-cutter mold of normal. The trouble started when Lucas inherited his parents' modest home in a picturesque suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where lawns were trimmed to military precision and neighbors competed over who could host the most elaborate 4th of July barbecue. But beneath the manicured hedges and pastel-colored houses lurked a tyrannical entity known as the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. If you've never tangled with an HOA, count yourself lucky. These organizations are like the hall monitors of adulthood, wielding their power with all the grace of a toddler hyped up on sugar. In Lucas's neighborhood, the HOA was led by Garrett Caldwell, a man whose personality could best be described as dictator chic. Garrett had an uncanny ability to turn minor infractions, like leaving your trash bin out for an extra hour, into full-blown scandals worthy of daytime television. Lucas's crime? Installing a wheelchair ramp on his front porch. According to Garrett and his band of clipboard-wielding cronies, this ramp was an eyesore that violated HOA aesthetic guidelines. Never mind that it was essential for Lucas's mobility. To Garrett, it was practically graffiti on the Mona Lisa. At first, Lucas tried reasoning with the HOA. He sent polite emails explaining his situation and even offered to paint the ramp to match the house's exterior. But Garrett wasn't interested in compromise, he wanted compliance. When Lucas refused to remove the ramp, Garrett escalated things faster than you can say. Petty tyranny. Fines started piling up: $54 unauthorized construction, $100 for failure to comply, and $200 for general defiance. By the time Garrett threatened legal action, Lucas knew he was dealing with someone who'd weaponized bureaucracy. But here's where things get interesting. Lucas wasn't just any teenager. Beneath his quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance lay a razor-sharp intellect honed by years of devouring legal textbooks like they were comic books. While Garrett was busy flexing his HOA rulebook, Lucas was preparing for battle in a way no one expected. When the day of the hearing arrived, Garrett strutted into the courtroom like he owned the place, flanked by his team of lawyers who looked like they'd been plucked straight from a corporate recruitment video. Meanwhile, Lucas made his entrance with all the theatrical flair of a seasoned actor. His crutches clicked against the polished floor as he walked down the aisle, head held high and eyes scanning the room like he was sizing up his opponents in a chess match. The audience, composed mostly of HOA members eager to witness their leader's triumph, watched in stunned silence as Lucas took his seat at the defendant's table. Garrett couldn't resist sneering as he leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer. Whatever it was, it clearly involved underestimating Lucas. Little did they know, this teenager with crutches wasn't just here to defend himself. He was about to flip their entire narrative on its head. As Garrett began his opening statement, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and PowerPoint slides detailing Lucas's supposed crimes, Lucas sat back with an expression that could only be described as amused indifference. Garrett Caldwell, the self-proclaimed king of suburban order, stood before the courtroom like a Broadway performer in the role of his life. His tailored suit gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his PowerPoint presentation, complete with pie charts and stock photos of pristine lawns, was projected onto a screen behind him. Garrett wasn't just here to win. He was here to annihilate. And Lucas? He sat at the defendant's table, twirling a pen between his fingers like he was waiting for someone to deal him into a poker game. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garrett began, his voice dripping with faux sincerity, "this case isn't just about a ramp. It's about preserving the integrity of our community. He gestured dramatically toward the screen, where an image of Lucas's modest wheelchair ramp appeared alongside a photo of a perfectly manicured suburban home. "What we have here," Garrett continued, "is a blatant disregard for the rules that keep our neighborhood beautiful." Lucas raised an eyebrow. Beautiful? The HOA had spent years ignoring actual eyesores like Mr. Jenkins's rusty lawn flamingos and Mrs. Thompson's neon pink mailbox. But apparently, a functional wheelchair ramp was where they drew the line. Garrett wasn't done. He launched into a tirade about property values and community standards, using buzzwords so vague they could have been pulled from a corporate mission statement generator. By the time he finished, half the courtroom looked bored out of their minds, and Lucas was fighting back a smirk. When it was Lucas's turn to speak, he rose slowly from his seat, leaning on his crutches as he made his way to the podium. The room fell silent. Garrett leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly expecting Lucas to stumble over his words or beg for mercy. But Lucas wasn't here to beg. "Your Honor," Lucas began, his voice steady but laced with sarcasm, "I'd like to thank Mr. Caldwell for that riveting lecture on suburban aesthetics. Truly inspiring." A few people in the audience stifled laughs as Garrett's face turned an impressive shade of red. Lucas opened a folder filled with neatly organized documents and held up one of them for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is the original HOA agreement signed by my parents when they bought their house. Nowhere in this document does it say anything about wheelchair ramps being prohibited." Garrett squirmed in his seat but quickly recovered. "That agreement is outdated," he snapped. "We've updated our rules since then." Lucas didn't miss a beat. "Ah, yes, the infamous updated rules." He pulled out another document, a copy of the HOA's revised guidelines. "These were sent out last year, correct? Funny thing, I never received them." Garrett stammered something about mailing errors, but Lucas wasn't done. He flipped to another page in his folder and held up yet another document, proof that the HOA had failed to notify several residents about rule changes, a clear violation of their own bylaws. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as members of the audience exchanged glances. Some of them were HOA members who had blindly supported Garrett for years. Others were neighbors who'd been on the receiving end of his petty power plays. For the first time, they were starting to see cracks in Garrett's carefully constructed facade. Lucas wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the HOA's hypocrisy for everyone to see. Desperate to regain control, Garrett called one of his cronies, a so-called expert witness, to testify against Lucas. The witness was an architect who claimed that Lucas's ramp violated building codes and posed a safety hazard. Lucas let him talk for exactly 2 minutes before pulling out yet another document. An inspection report from a licensed contractor confirming that the ramp was perfectly safe and up to code. "Nice try," Lucas said with a grin as Garrett visibly deflated. As the hearing continued, it became clear that Garrett had underestimated Lucas in every possible way. While Garrett relied on theatrics and intimidation tactics, Lucas countered with cold, hard facts, and just enough sarcasm to keep things entertaining. At one point, Garrett tried to argue that Lucas's ramp was lowering property values in the neighborhood. Lucas responded by presenting data showing that accessible homes actually increased market value, a fact backed by multiple studies. By now, even Garrett's own lawyers were starting to look uncomfortable. One of them whispered something to Garrett, who waved him off impatiently. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for Garrett, Lucas delivered his piece de resistance. Evidence that the HOA had been selectively enforcing its rules for years. Using photos and testimonies from other residents, Lucas proved that Garrett had overlooked countless violations, from illegal fences to unsightly lawn ornaments, while targeting specific individuals for minor infractions. "Your Honor," Lucas concluded, "this isn't about preserving community standards. It's about power, and Mr. Caldwell has been abusing it." The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Garrett looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. As the hearing adjourned for lunch break, Lucas returned to his seat with an air of quiet triumph, while Garrett stormed out of the courtroom muttering under his breath. The audience buzzed with excitement as people began whispering about what they'd just witnessed. For years, Garrett had ruled over their neighborhood like a petty tyrant. But now there was hope that someone might finally put him in his place. If Garrett Caldwell was a balloon, the morning session of the hearing had left him deflated, but not entirely popped. As the courtroom reconvened after lunch, he strutted back in with the forced confidence of a man who had just Googled how to win a court case you're clearly losing. His tie was slightly askew, his hair less polished, and his smile, once smug, now looked more like a grimace. Lucas, on the other hand, returned to his seat with the calm demeanor of someone who knew he had all the cards and was just waiting for the right moment to play them. The audience had grown noticeably larger. Word had spread about the teenager who was single-handedly dismantling the HOA's case, and neighbors who'd previously avoided Garrett like the plague were now showing up to watch him squirm. Some even brought popcorn. Garrett began his next move with a renewed sense of theatricality. He called another witness, a landscaping expert, who claimed that Lucas's wheelchair ramp clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. The witness droned on about how the ramp's color didn't match the house's trim and how its design disrupted the visual flow of the street. Lucas leaned over to his table and whispered something to himself. Was it a prayer? A curse? No one could tell. But when it was his turn to cross-examine, he stood up with an expression that said, "This is going to be fun." "Mr. Landscaping Expert," Lucas began, his tone polite but dripping with sarcasm, "can you confirm for the court that you've personally inspected every property in our neighborhood?" The expert hesitated. "Well, no." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. So you're not aware of Mr. Jenkins's front yard flamingos or Mrs. Thompson's neon pink mailbox?" The expert shifted uncomfortably. I might have seen them." Lucas smiled innocently. "And did those design choices disrupt the visual flow of the street?" The audience chuckled as Garrett buried his face in his hands. As Lucas continued to dismantle Garrett's witnesses one by one, it became increasingly clear that Garrett was running out of ammunition and patience. When Lucas presented photographic evidence of HOA-approved violations far worse than his wheelchair ramp, including one neighbor's bizarre collection of garden gnomes dressed as pirates, Garrett finally snapped. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This isn't about flamingos or gnomes. It's about following the rules." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You mean like how your HOA failed to follow its own rules when it didn't notify residents about updated guidelines?" The courtroom erupted into laughter as Garrett sputtered incoherently. Even the judge couldn't hide a smirk. With Garrett on the ropes, Lucas decided it was time to deliver his knockout punch. He stood up and addressed the court with a confidence that belied his age. "Your Honor," he began, holding up yet another document from his seemingly bottomless folder of evidence. "I'd like to introduce Exhibit Z, a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act." The room went silent. "This federal law," Lucas continued, "explicitly prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in housing-related matters, including unreasonable restrictions on accessibility modifications." He turned to face Garrett directly. "By targeting my wheelchair ramp and attempting to fine me into submission, Mr. Caldwell and his HOA have not only violated their own bylaws but also federal law." Garrett's jaw dropped so fast it could have hit the floor. His lawyers frantically shuffled through their notes, clearly unprepared for this revelation. The audience, once filled with HOA loyalists, was now firmly on Team Lucas. Neighbors who'd previously feared retaliation from Garrett began whispering excitedly among themselves. Some even started clapping before being shushed by the bailiff. For years, Garrett had ruled over their community with an iron fist, using obscure rules and petty fines to keep everyone in line. But now they were watching a teenager with crutches systematically dismantle everything he stood for. In a last-ditch effort to salvage what little credibility he had left, Garrett stood up and tried to argue that Lucas was exploiting a loophole in the law. "This isn't about discrimination," he shouted, his voice cracking under pressure. "It's about maintaining order." Lucas didn't even bother responding directly. Instead, he turned back to the judge and said calmly, "Your Honor, I believe Mr. Caldwell just admitted that this case has nothing to do with legal violations and everything to do with personal bias. The judge nodded thoughtfully before turning to Garrett. "Mr. Caldwell," she said sternly, "I suggest you sit down before you dig yourself into an even deeper hole." Garrett sat down so fast it was almost comical. Before resting his case, Lucas delivered one final blow, a request for damages. "Your Honor," he said, "not only has this ordeal caused me significant emotional distress, but it has also cost me time and money that I could have spent on more productive endeavors, like finishing my college applications." He paused for effect before adding with a grin, "I think it's only fair that Mr. Caldwell and his HOA cover those costs." The audience erupted into applause as Garrett slumped in his chair like a defeated cartoon villain. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Lucas walked out of the courtroom with his head held high and his crutches clicking rhythmically against the floor, a sound that now seemed less like a limitation and more like a victory march. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread far and wide, and now it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up to witness the final act of the HOA saga. Garrett Caldwell sat at his table, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd bet his life savings on a losing horse. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his once smug expression had been replaced by a look of pure desperation. Lucas Dawson, meanwhile, sat calmly at the defendant's table, flipping through his notes like he was reviewing answers for a pop quiz he knew he'd aced. The judge entered the room, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a hint of amusement. After all, it wasn't every day she presided over a case where a teenager with crutches managed to outmaneuver an entire HOA. Garrett stood up for his closing argument, clutching his notes like they were a lifeline. His voice wavered as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about discrimination or personal bias. It's about maintaining the integrity of our community." He gestured toward the audience, as if hoping for their support. "We have rules for a reason. Rules that ensure our neighborhood remains a safe and pleasant place to live." Lucas raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He didn't need to. Garrett was doing a fine job of digging his own grave. Garrett continued, his tone growing more frantic with each word. "If we allow exceptions like this ramp, where does it end? What's next? People painting their houses neon green, installing inflatable pools in their front yards? Chaos." The audience exchanged amused glances. Chaos? Really? This was the same HOA that had ignored Mrs. Thompson's mailbox monstrosity and Mr. Jenkins's flamingo army for years. When it was Lucas's turn to speak, he rose from his seat with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire hearing. He adjusted his crutches and walked to the podium, the rhythmic click of metal against tile echoing through the room. "Your Honor," he began, "I'd like to thank Mr. Caldwell for that passionate speech about chaos and neon green houses. Truly inspiring." The audience chuckled as Garrett glared daggers at Lucas. "But let's talk about what this case is really about," Lucas continued. "It's not about preserving community standards or protecting property values. It's about power." He turned to face Garrett directly. "Mr. Caldwell and his HOA have spent years using obscure rules and petty fines to bully residents into submission." Lucas paused for effect before holding up a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the same document he'd introduced earlier in the hearing. "And in this case, they've crossed a line, not just ethically, but legally." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment or favors. I'm asking for justice, for myself and for every resident who's ever been targeted by this HOA's arbitrary enforcement of its rules." The audience erupted into applause before being shushed by the bailiff. The judge leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on her desk as she addressed Garrett. "Mr. Caldwell," she said sternly, "I've reviewed the evidence presented in this case, and frankly, I'm appalled by your behavior." Garrett shrank in his seat like a deflated balloon. "You've selectively enforced your rules, failed to notify residents of policy changes, and violated federal law by targeting Mr. Dawson's wheelchair ramp," she continued. "This isn't just poor management. It's outright discrimination." Garrett opened his mouth to protest but quickly shut it when the judge shot him a look that could have melted steel. Turning to Lucas, the judge softened her tone slightly. "Mr. Dawson," she said, You've shown remarkable resilience and intelligence throughout this hearing. It's clear that you've not only defended yourself but also exposed systemic issues within this HOA. Lucas nodded respectfully but remained silent. The judge took a deep breath before delivering her verdict. "I hereby rule in favor of Mr. Dawson," she declared firmly. "The HOA's claims against him are dismissed with prejudice." Garrett looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon whole. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm ordering the HOA to pay restitution to Mr. Dawson for emotional distress and legal fees incurred during this case." The audience erupted into cheers as Garrett slumped forward in defeat. And finally, the judge added with a pointed look at Garrett, "I'm recommending that this HOA undergo an independent audit to ensure compliance with federal laws moving forward." Lucas couldn't resist smiling at that last part. It was the cherry on top of an already sweet victory. As the courtroom emptied out, Garrett tried one last time to salvage his reputation, or what little remained of it. "This isn't over," he shouted at no one in particular as he stormed out of the room. "You'll regret this." Lucas watched him go with an amused expression before turning back to pack up his things. One neighbor leaned over and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like Garrett finally met someone who doesn't play by his rules." As Lucas exited the courthouse, he was greeted by neighbors who'd once been too afraid to stand up to Garrett, but were now eager to congratulate him on his victory. "You really showed him," one woman said with a grin. "About time someone put that guy in his place," another added. Lucas accepted their praise graciously but didn't linger too long. He had bigger plans ahead, like finishing those college applications he'd mentioned during the hearing. Walking down the courthouse steps with his crutches clicking rhythmically against the pavement, Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in himself but in what he'd accomplished for his community. For years, Garrett Caldwell had ruled over their neighborhood like a petty tyrant. But today marked the beginning of the end for his reign, and Lucas couldn't be happier about it. The courtroom victory was the talk of the town. By the time Lucas Dawson returned home, he was something of a local celebrity. His neighbors, many of whom had spent years living in quiet fear of Garrett Caldwell and his HOA goons, now saw Lucas as their champion, a modern-day David who had taken down their suburban Goliath. As Lucas hobbled up his wheelchair ramp, which now felt less like a point of contention and more like a trophy, he noticed something unusual. His neighbors were waving at him, smiling even. It was as if the entire street had collectively decided to shed the oppressive weight of Garrett's tyranny and embrace their newfound freedom. But Lucas wasn't done yet. Oh no, the wheels of justice were still turning, and Garrett Caldwell was about to find out what happens when you mess with someone who knows how to play the long game. In the days following the trial, Garrett's carefully curated image as the protector of the neighborhood crumbled faster than a poorly made soufflé. The judge's recommendation for an independent audit of the HOA turned out to be less of a suggestion and more of an order. And within weeks, auditors descended upon the HOA office like vultures to carrion. What they found wasn't just incompetence. It was a treasure trove of corruption. Misappropriated funds, fabricated fines, and suspiciously large administrative fees that seemed to funnel directly into Garrett's personal bank account. It turned out that Garrett hadn't just been enforcing rules unfairly. He'd been using the HOA as his own personal piggy bank. When news of the scandal broke, it spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Garrett went from being the self-proclaimed king of suburbia to its most despised resident. People who once cowered under his glare now openly mocked him in group chats and at block parties. Someone even put up a lawn sign that read, "Free flamingos for everyone." In honor of Lucas's courtroom takedown, Lucas could have gloated. He could have thrown a massive party or plastered "I told you so" signs all over the neighborhood, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he opted for a quieter form of revenge, one that would leave Garrett stewing in his own humiliation for years to come. First, Lucas organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss reforming the HOA. For years, Garrett had run it like a dictatorship, but Lucas proposed turning it into a democratic system where every resident had an equal voice. The idea was met with enthusiastic applause, and within weeks, Garrett was officially voted out as HOA president. Next, Lucas spearheaded an initiative to rewrite the HOA bylaws entirely. Gone were the arbitrary rules about lawn ornaments and paint colors. In their place were clear, fair guidelines designed to promote inclusivity and community spirit. And yes, wheelchair ramps were explicitly protected under the new rules, a fact that Lucas made sure to highlight in bold print. But perhaps Lucas's most satisfying move was his decision to donate part of his court-ordered restitution money to a local disability advocacy group. The donation came with one condition. They had to use some of the funds to produce educational materials about accessibility laws and distribute them to HOAs across the state. While Lucas was busy building a better future for his neighborhood, Garrett was busy dealing with the fallout from his actions. After being ousted as HOA president, he tried to maintain some semblance of dignity by claiming he'd voluntarily stepped down to focus on personal projects. But no one bought it. Not even his closest allies, most of whom had already jumped ship. Things only got worse when Garrett received notice that he was being sued by several residents for financial misconduct during his tenure as HOA president. The lawsuits dragged on for months, draining what little remained of his savings and forcing him to sell his house, the very house he'd once lorded over like a king. Rumor had it that Garrett moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far away from anyone who might recognize him. Occasionally, someone would spot him at the grocery store or gas station, looking disheveled and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might bring up his past. With Garrett gone and the HOA reformed, life in the neighborhood began to change, for the better. People started talking to each other again, hosting block parties and potlucks without fear of being fined for unauthorized gatherings. Kids played freely in their yards without worrying about violating obscure noise ordinances. Even Mr. Jenkins's flamingos seemed happier, though that might have just been because someone finally gave them a fresh coat of paint. As for Lucas, he became something of a legend in his community, a symbol of resilience and justice in the face of adversity. Neighbors often stopped by his house to thank him or drop off baked goods, which he happily accepted because, hey, free cookies. But Lucas didn't let his newfound fame go to his head. He still spent most evenings studying law books or working on college applications, because while taking down an HOA tyrant was satisfying, he knew there were bigger battles waiting for him out in the world. One sunny afternoon, as Lucas sat on his porch sipping lemonade and enjoying the peaceful hum of his newly harmonious neighborhood, a young boy approached him nervously. "Mr. Dawson?" the boy asked. Lucas smiled warmly. "Just call me Lucas." The boy hesitated before blurting out, "My mom says you're like a superhero." Lucas laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet street. "A superhero? I don't know about that." "But you beat Mr. Caldwell," the boy insisted, "and you saved our neighborhood." Lucas leaned forward on his crutches, meeting the boy's gaze with a twinkle in his eye. "Well," he said with mock seriousness, "if I'm a superhero, then I guess my superpower is knowing how to read fine print." The boy giggled before running off down the street, leaving Lucas alone with his thoughts and his lemonade. As he watched neighbors chatting happily over their fences and kids racing bikes down freshly paved sidewalks, Lucas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not just in what he'd accomplished, but in what it represented. Because sometimes, even in a world full of chaos and injustice, one person really can make a difference, even if they have to do it on crutches. And with that thought in mind, Lucas leaned back in his chair and smiled, ready for whatever challenges life might throw at him next.